Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission is always the same. We take a mountain of source material articles, research, historical texts, and deliver the critical knowledge and surprising insights you need fast.
And today we are taking a monumental leap across history.
Here we are. We're landing squarely on the Renaissance. And this wasn't just a stylish blip or, an art movement.
No, not at all.
It was the hinge. It was the pivot point that allowed the medieval world to transition into the modernity we inhabit today.
That's absolutely right. Our sources for this provide a really comprehensive overview. We're going far beyond the famous artists, past the Da Vinci's and the Michelangelos.
Important as they are.
Of course. But we're going to look at the massive shifts in artistic realism, political philosophy, and the astonishingly specific social, economic, and even microbial factors that kickstarted the entire movement.
Right. And our goal is to dive deep into the DNA of this period. The core question we're tackling is, on the surface, simple, but the answer is incredibly complex. What does Renaissance, or Renascita, meaning rebirth, actually signify? And what specific perfect storm of conditions allowed this explosion of knowledge to happen precisely where and when it did?
First in Italy and then spreading across Europe.
Exactly.
And it's the interaction of these seemingly unrelated things that makes it so fascinating. You have the hyper-specific political landscape of the Italian city-states,
Right.
the sudden violent redistribution of wealth following the plague, and then this influx of long-lost classical wisdom.
So we have to view this not as a neat chapter in a history book.
No, you can't. You have to see it as a messy, transitional period of immense creative ferment.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
So when we talk about the Renaissance, let's start with just the basic scope and definition. We're looking at a huge span of time here. What are the conventional bookends for this period?
Well, conventionally, we define the Renaissance as a European period of history and a cultural movement that covers roughly the 14th through the 17th centuries.
100 years.
About that, yes. And it marks that crucial transition from the Middle Ages to modernity. The central kind of defining characteristic is the revival and rediscovery of the literary, philosophical, and artistic achievements of classical antiquity.
So Greece and Rome.
Primarily Greece and Rome, yes.
And where do we first see these beginnings taking root? It has to be Italy, right?
Oh, yes. The first signs appear in Italy, and surprisingly early. We often categorize it as the Proto-Renaissance, as early as the late 13th century.
It is early.
It is. Think of foundational literary figures like Dante Alighieri. His Divine Comedy already showed a break from the strictly medieval allegories.
Right. It feels more human, more personal.
Exactly. And then you have the revolutionary approach to painting introduced by Giotto di Bondone around the turn of the 14th century. They were, in a sense, setting the table for everything that was to come.
But I know that timeline is anything but rigid. Historians have pretty fierce arguments over where one period ends and another begins. Just how flexible are these start and end dates?
They are incredibly flexible, which leads to some substantial periodization debates. For instance, you have some scholars who argue for what they call the Long Renaissance.
The Long Renaissance.
Yeah, and they push it from the 14th century all the way to the 17th century. They want to encompass things like the scientific revolution and the age of exploration as part of the same continuous movement.
So that would sweep in figures like Galileo, even Bacon.
Precisely. But conversely, the focus often narrows to just the 15th and 16th centuries when you're talking about the High Renaissance. That's the period of maximal artistic output centered in Florence and Rome.
And is there a specific political event that historians use to mark the conventional end of the Italian chapter of this rebirth?
There is, and it's a pretty grim one. The conclusion is usually pegged to the year 1527.
What happened then?
That was the devastating sack of Rome, which occurred during the War of the League of Cognac. The city of Rome, which had briefly replaced Florence as the artistic and intellectual center.
Under popes like the Borgias and the Medicis.
Right. That city was utterly ravaged by the imperial troops of Charles V. It was a catastrophic political and military event that scattered artists and scholars across Italy and up into northern Europe.
So it effectively shifted the intellectual center of gravity away from Rome.
It did, though. The artistic momentum, through figures like Tintoretto and Veronese definitely continued elsewhere, especially in Venice.
What I find really fascinating is the changing perception of the relationship between the Renaissance and the Middle Ages. I think a lot of us grew up learning about the Renaissance as the moment we stepped out of the quote-unquote Dark Ages.
Right.
That seems to be a very dated view now.
It is. That traditional view, the one that champions the Renaissance for being purely early modern, it stresses a sharp, almost miraculous break from what they characterized as the barbaric past.
A clean slate.
A clean slate, exactly. But the modern scholarly consensus, driven largely by social and economic historians, emphasizes what's called the continuity thesis.
So the argument isn't that the Middle Ages were unimportant,
Not at all.
but that the Renaissance was actually built directly on them.
Precisely. Many contemporary historians argue that the Renaissance was more of an extension of the late Middle Ages than a sharp break.
Okay.
The art historian Erwin Panofsky, he famously said the two eras were connected by 1,000 ties. Things like commercial growth, early political structures, even some intellectual curiosity, those were already in motion.
So the Renaissance was more of a massive acceleration.
An acceleration, not a sudden awakening. That's why a lot of historians today prefer the term early modern period. It highlights the transitional nature without implying the preceding 1,000 years were just dark or primitive.
And where did this idea of a sudden clean rebirth even come from in the first place? Who coined the term?
The idea of a rebirth, Rinascita, first appeared in the middle of the 16th century, around 1550.
So while it was still happening.
Yes, very much so. It was coined by the painter and art historian Giorgio Vasari in his hugely influential work, Lives of the Artists.
Ah.
And Vasari, being a product of this very movement, used the term to define what he saw as a break from the perceived barbarities of Gothic art. He credited his Tuscan predecessors, artists like Cimabue and Giotto, with single-handedly reversing the artistic decline that he believed followed the collapse of the Roman Empire.
So initially it was a self-conscious term, but it was applied purely to aesthetic and cultural style.
That's the critical point. It was an art historical term. It was a declaration of aesthetic superiority over the immediate past.
And it wasn't until much later that it got broadened to describe a whole historical era.
Exactly. Not until the 19th century. That's when the French equivalent, Renaissance, was popularized and adopted into English as a comprehensive term describing an entire historical period and intellectual movement. The French historian Jules Michelet really cemented this shift in his 1855 work, Histoire de France.
It's interesting how the focus shifted, too. You said Vasari focused on art.
He did. But Michelet emphasized science and politics, claiming the period spanned from Columbus to Galileo, which, further broadened that definition into what we understand today.
It's just so interesting that the self-identification happened almost immediately, but the modern, sweeping historical label came 300 years later. It really shows the power of narrative to shape our understanding of history.
Absolutely. And it sets the stage perfectly for our discussion, because the people living through it believed they were engaged in a radical, clean break. They were driven by a desire to study and imitate nature, combined with a renewed focus on classical antiquity. Their belief in their own unique moment became a defining feature of the age.
So we've established that this wasn't just a general European cultural movement. The spark caught fire first and most intensely in Italy, specifically in the Republic of Florence.
Right, before spreading out across the peninsula to places like Venice, Genoa, Rome, Naples.
But why Florence? What made its environment so uniquely conducive to generating geniuses like Leonardo and Botticelli and Michelangelo?
Okay, so here's where it gets really interesting. We can look at the proto-Renaissance figures like Dante, Petrarch, and Giotto, laying the philosophical and artistic groundwork in the late 13th century.
That's true. But you're saying there's a more specific moment.
There is. If you want to be utterly specific, some historians point to the year 1401, a moment of intense, high-stakes public rivalry.
That has to be the competition for the bronze doors of the Florence Cathedral Baptistry.
It is. The competition pitted the young, aggressive Filippo Brunelleschi against the ultimately successful Lorenzo Ghiberti.
And they both had to submit a panel depicting the sacrifice of Isaac.
They did. And this wasn't just a commission. It was a public test of skill, a clash of ambitious genius right out in the open. The intense focus on technical mastery and classical ideals in that single competition is often seen as the dramatic, specific catalyst for the explosion of creative output that followed.
So a climate of aggressive professional rivalry was a key factor.
A huge factor. The competition between rival masters, like Brunelleschi and Donatello later on, it helped accelerate the whole movement to impossible speeds.
But that rivalry had to exist within a broader structure. What was so unique about Italian geography and politics at that time?
Well, we can break it down into four interlocking structural factors. First, and this is maybe the most obvious one, is urbanization and classical ruins.
Okay.
15th century Italy was highly urbanized, far more so than the rest of Europe, which was still largely agrarian and feudal.
Mhm.
And crucially, these cities, Florence, Siena, Rome, they were literally built among the ruins of the Roman Empire. You couldn't walk through Florence without stumbling over ancient stonework, broken sculptures, or Roman roads. The past was a palpable physical presence.
So it made the rebirth of antiquity feel immediate and, I suppose, achievable.
Exactly. It wasn't some abstract idea from a book. It was right there under your feet.
And the political situation was also completely different from the monarchies and feudal structures we see everywhere else in Europe.
That's the second crucial factor: republicanism and liberty. Italian cities had successfully exited the feudal system centuries earlier.
They were independent.
They were. Florence and Venice were independent city-states operating as merchant republics, and they fostered anti-monarchical thinking and a strong sense of civic duty. They saw themselves as heirs to the Roman Republic, not the Roman Empire.
A huge distinction.
A massive one. It meant that power didn't flow solely from a divinely ordained monarch. It flowed from citizen participation and, importantly, from commercial success.
And we have that wonderful visual proof you pointed out in the sources, Lorenzetti's fresco in Siena.
Yes, Ambrogio Lorenzetti's The Allegory of Good and Bad Government. It was painted between 1338 and 1340, and it perfectly encapsulates these civic ideals.
It's basically a political cartoon.
In a way, yes. It's an explicit visual argument for the virtues of justice, good administration, and fairness within a republican framework. This art was didactic. It was meant to teach the duties of citizenship and illustrate the disastrous consequences of tyranny. It proves that these republican ideas were central to the identity of these cities long before the High Renaissance even began.
And all of this civic activity, all these grand projects, they must have been fueled by incredible amounts of money.
They were. And that's our third factor, the economic catalyst. Venice was the gateway to trade with the East, funneling luxury goods into Europe. Florence became the capital of textiles and, more importantly, banking.
The Medici Bank.
The Medici Bank, among others. The sheer wealth generated by this commerce created a society rich in disposable capital. The sociologist Rodney Stark argues this was the necessary preceding factor for the Renaissance to even happen.
So the money came first.
The money had to be there to finance the massive public works, the private artistic commissions, and, critically, to afford the intellectual class the leisure time they needed to pursue the Studia Humanitatis. You can't study ancient Greek if you're worried about your next meal.
Okay, so let's turn to the grim, unexpected catalyst that changed the economic and social calculus entirely. The Black Death.
The Black Death. It sweeps across Europe between 1348 and 1350, and it has a profound, dark, yet ultimately catalyzing impact. Florence's population was devastated, nearly halved in just a few years.
It's hard to even imagine.
And this sudden, horrific mortality had immediate economic and philosophical consequences.
How does massive death promote the conditions for intellectual rebirth? That just feels like a paradox.
It does. On the philosophical side, some theories suggest that the constant, close familiarity with death shifted the intellectual focus.
Away from the afterlife.
Right. Instead of dedicating all thought to the abstract concerns of spirituality and what comes next, thinkers began to dwell intensely on the world they could see, life on Earth, the human form, human potential. It was a perfect alignment with the coming humanist movement.
And what about the economic side? That seems more straightforward.
It was more structural, yes. The massive drop in the labor pool dramatically increased the value of the surviving working class.
Supply and demand.
Basic supply and demand. This led to far greater freedom, job mobility, and economic bargaining power for commoners. This was the moment labor truly gained leverage.
And property must have changed hands constantly.
Constantly. The immense mortality often resulted in plague survivors inheriting property and capital, sometimes multiple times over. Land values plummeted by as much as 30 to 40% across Europe. This redistribution of wealth created a new, capital-rich, and socially mobile class with the means to become patrons and engage in civic life.
So the demographic collapse created the capital that was necessary to fund the massive artistic projects of the next century. This then leads us directly to the great patrons.
Indeed. The wealth accumulated by families like the Medici, a banking dynasty, became essential. Now, the Renaissance was already underway before them, but the Medici family provided the financial stability, the cultural demand, and the competitive environment needed for the great men to thrive.
Lorenzo de' Medici the Magnificent.
Lorenzo the Magnificent especially. He transformed Florence into the cultural capital of Europe through his enormous patronage, commissioning works from Da Vinci, Botticelli, and Michelangelo, and creating institutions like the Platonic Academy.
And finally, we have to mention the critical intellectual infusion that arrived from the Eastern world, the last piece of the puzzle.
This is the role of migrating scholars. The final major catalyst occurred in 1453.
The fall of Constantinople to the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. This event scattered Byzantine Greek scholars who fled west to Italian cities. And these scholars carried priceless manuscripts, many in ancient Greek, that had been obscure, unstudied, or outright lost in Western Europe since the time of the late Roman Empire.
So it was this sudden, massive influx of original Greek cultural texts that was the fuel that really ignited the humanist fire.
It was the rocket fuel, absolutely.
So if Italy provided the money and the political freedom, humanism provided the intellectual methodology to unlock all that ancient wisdom.
Yes.
And it's crucial to stress, as the sources do, that Renaissance humanism wasn't a prescriptive philosophy like Platonism or Stoicism. It was fundamentally a new method of learning.
That's the most important distinction you can make. It was a methodology designed to replace medieval scholasticism.
Can you break that down? What's the difference?
Well, scholasticism focused on resolving contradictions between existing, often mediated authorities. Think of Aristotle, but filtered through generations of commentaries. Humanism, however, insisted on going back to the source ad fontes. It meant studying ancient texts in their original languages, applying critical reasoning, and prioritizing empirical evidence over received wisdom.
And this methodology was then formalized in education.
It was. It was rooted in the classical Roman concept of humanitas, which means the refinement of mind and character. The educational program was known as the Studia Humanitatis, and it focused on 5 core humanities: poetry, grammar, history, moral philosophy, and rhetoric.
Why those 5 subjects specifically? What was the underlying goal of that curriculum?
The underlying goal was the education of the citizen for active civic life. That's the key. Medieval education, which was based on the trivium and quadrivium, prepared scholars for a contemplative religious life, or maybe for legal careers.
For the monastery or the court?
Exactly. Humanism, in contrast, aimed to create effective orators, moral leaders, and informed participants in the Republican city-states. It asserted the genius of man, and it focused on the ideal of the uomo universal.
The universal man.
The universal man. The ideal of intellectual, moral, and physical excellence that was required to function honorably in this newly competitive and increasingly secularizing world.
And the recovery of all these texts didn't happen all at once either. The sources outline a distinct 2-phase process.
Yes, the recovery was very structured. The first phase was the Latin phase in the 14th century.
Okay.
This was spearheaded by figures like Petrarch and the famous manuscript hunter Poggio Bracciolini. They spent years, scouring monastic libraries all across Europe, recovering Latin literary, historical, and oratorical works by authors like Cicero, Lucretius, and Seneca. By the early 15th century, most surviving Latin literature was back in circulation.
But the real challenge was the Greek material. That was almost completely alien to the Latin West at that point.
That was the next big hurdle, and it began the Greek phase in the early 15th century. This focused on ancient Greek literary, historical, and theological texts, Homer's epics, the histories of Thucydides, the Greek dramatists, and, critically, the original Greek New Testament.
And that's a key distinction, because the West had some access to Greek science and philosophy already.
Right, they had Aristotle, but primarily through later Arabic translations. The literary and cultural texts had been completely unstudied in the West since Antiquity. This was all new.
And the launch of this massive project is traceable to one key moment, one invitation.
It is often dated to 1396, when the Florentine chancellor, a man named Coluccio Salutati, invited the Byzantine scholar Manuel Chrysoloras to come and teach Greek in Florence.
And that was it. That was the start.
That marked the official, systematic beginning of Greek studies in the West. Chrysoloras' students would go on to be major translators and scholars themselves, spreading the knowledge.
Now wait, you mentioned Arabic translations. If the scholars fleeing Constantinople brought the Greek cultural texts, how does Islamic scholarship connect to this rebirth? This seems like a vital but often missed piece of the continuity puzzle.
It is absolutely essential context. You're right. While the 15th century Renaissance reintroduced the cultural texts, the poetry, the rhetoric, The philosophical and scientific foundations of Greek thought had been preserved for centuries
As who?
by Muslim logicians like Avicenna and Averroes. When the Islamic empires expanded, they inherited the Greek intellectual tradition from the Hellenistic world. Their advanced libraries and sophisticated philosophical communities ensured that these ideas were translated and kept alive.
So they were the custodians of that knowledge.
For centuries, this vast body of knowledge on mathematics, optics, medicine, philosophy, it worked its way back into Western Europe via multicultural centers like the Toledo School of Translators in Iberia between the 11th and 13th centuries.
So Islam essentially provided the philosophical structure.
Yes, the foundations. And that allowed the Latin West to build upon it when the 15th century scholars reintroduced the literary ornaments.
And that restored knowledge base led to immediate intellectual application. We see political commentary and philosophical manifestos emerging very quickly.
The impact was immediate and profound. In political thought, you have thinkers like Niccolo Machiavelli and Sir Thomas More. They applied classical ideas derived from authors like Livy and Plato to create these radical critiques of contemporary government.
Machiavelli's The Prince is a perfect example.
A perfect one. It's a direct application of observations drawn from the Roman world to the chaotic reality of 16th century Italian politics. And we should note this tradition of using history for political analysis had already been established by the Islamic scholar Ibn Khaldun in his histories.
And then there's the great celebration of human potential, the Manifesto of the Renaissance.
That would be Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's oration on the dignity of man from 1486.
Why is it called the Manifesto?
It's frequently called that because it was just this utterly vibrant, ringing defense of philosophy, faith, and even magic, all reconciled and defended on the grounds of human reason and free will. It crystallized the idea that humanity occupied a central, unique, and powerful place in the universe.
It's interesting how this focus on original texts, which feels secular in its method, profoundly affected religion. It ultimately led to a direct challenge to the church itself.
It absolutely did. And while the humanists were not anti-Christian, many were deeply pious, their commitment to original sources was relentless.
So they applied the same critical lens to religious
The
texts.
same lens. The new focus on original Greek Christian works led to critical textual criticism. A scholar named Lorenzo Valla demonstrated, through pure linguistic analysis, that the donation of Constantine, a document the papacy used to claim temporal power, was a forgery.
Wow.
And later, Erasmus of Rotterdam used the humanist method to produce a critical edition of the New Testament in its original Greek, exposing errors in the long-used Latin Vulgate translation.
And this critical questioning methodology is what paved the way for figures like Martin Luther and the Reformation.
Yes. The humanists, particularly Erasmus, provided the intellectual tools, the rigorous textual analysis, and the demand for a return to the sources that the reformers then wielded to challenge the central doctrines and institutional structures of the Roman Catholic Church. The method started as linguistic and very quickly became theological and political.
Finally, let's consider the physical spaces where all this new knowledge thrived, the libraries. We often think of medieval libraries as these closed monastic spaces, very locked down. How did the Renaissance library differ?
It was a conscious shift toward openness, a unique characteristic of many Renaissance libraries, especially those funded by wealthy patrons, is that they were often designed to be open to the public. They were constructed as these grand architectural temples to knowledge.
They were meant to be used not just to preserve.
Exactly. They were designed to facilitate the free exchange of ideas and critical thinking, rather than merely store sacred texts. These bibliophiles understood that the democratization of classical and humanist learning was essential for the flourishing of their society.
So the philosophical shift of humanism rapidly translated into these visible, tangible revolutions across art, architecture, science, and our physical understanding of the world. Let's start with art, where the change from the medieval tradition was perhaps the most dramatic.
The core artistic breakthrough was the aggressive and systematic pursuit of realism, which culminated in the formal development of a linear perspective.
So a move from symbolic to realistic.
Precisely. Medieval art was symbolic. Renaissance art became a literal mirror of the world.
Giotto took the first step. We mentioned him earlier. But it was Brunelleschi and Alberti who were the ones who truly formalized it using mathematics.
Absolutely. Giotto treated the painting surface as a conceptual window into space, giving his figures weight and volume. But it was Filippo Brunelleschi, the architect, who developed and demonstrated the mathematical principles of perspective around 1420.
How do you do that?
He supposedly did this using mirrors and paintings of the Florence baptistry, proving that geometric recession could create the illusion of three-dimensional depth on a two-dimensional surface. Then, Leon Battista Alberti formalized these geometrical laws in his treatise Della Pittura in 1435.
So he wrote the instruction manual.
He wrote the instruction manual, transforming perspective from a clever trick into a fundamental, teachable artistic technique rooted in the humanist ideal of mathematics.
And this systematic approach turned the artist into the ultimate uomo universal, part mathematician, part anatomist, part philosopher.
The polymath artists exemplify this fusion perfectly.
Yeah.
Leonardo da Vinci, for instance, wasn't just an artist. He embodied the spirit of empirical observation.
He studied anatomy.
He studied human anatomy through extensive dissection, going far beyond what was required for mere artistic representation. He pioneered techniques of sfumato, that's the blending of light and shadow, and his famous Vitruvian Man perfectly illustrates the Renaissance obsession with finding the geometric ideal.
Which was drawn directly from classical specifications.
From the 1st century BC architectural treatise by Vitruvius, it's a direct line back.
And the architecture itself also underwent this systematic classical rebirth.
Brunelleschi, again, was the pioneer. He formulated the core Renaissance style by meticulously studying the classical remains in Rome, applying Vitruvius's principles, and mathematically calculating proportions based on the Roman order's Tuscan composite Corinthian.
And his masterpiece, the dome of Florence Cathedral.
An engineering marvel. He managed to achieve that height and stability without the need for flying buttresses, which was a deliberate public rejection of the Gothic style. Then Leon Battista Alberti continued this trend, using the monumental arch and classical columns as integrated mathematical systems in buildings like the Basilica of Sant'Andrea in Mantua.
Before we move on to science, we have to acknowledge the technical influence that was flowing into Italy from the north. It wasn't a one-way street.
No, absolutely not. The Low Countries had a vibrant, almost pre-Renaissance focus on naturalism. Artists like Jan van Eyck and Hugo van der Goes, operating in the 15th century, excelled at this hyper-detailed observational realism.
And they brought a key technology with them.
They did. Crucially, they introduced the use of oil paint and canvas to Italy. This medium, which allows for greater depth of color, subtlety, and revision, greatly accelerated the Italian pursuit of naturalism and realism. It had a tremendous influence on the art of the High Renaissance.
Okay, moving to science. The Renaissance didn't fully launch the scientific revolution, but it clearly laid the foundation by shifting the whole method of inquiry.
It fostered the critical reliance on observation and inductive reasoning that science absolutely requires. And two non-intellectual factors were key catalysts here.
Oh, were they?
First, the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg around 1440. This technology just sped up the dissemination of ideas exponentially. It moved learning beyond the monastery and created a community of scholars who could challenge, replicate, and refine each other's hypotheses.
The democratization of knowledge.
It was foundational. And the second factor was geographical. The discovery that the ancient world's geography was fundamentally wrong.
Right. Christopher Columbus's voyage in 1492, followed by others, and the discovery of the New World.
Exactly. And this was a profound intellectual shock. The science historian David Wooten argues that this discovery, the existence of entirely new continents, could not be reconciled with the established classical worldview, particularly the geography of Ptolemy.
So it proved that the revered ancients were fallible.
They were fallible. It gave intellectual permission to challenge their doctrines in other fields, like medicine and cosmology. And this challenge, combined with the press, directly catalyzed the later scientific revolution.
In this context, Da Vinci emerges not just as an artist, but as a proto-modern scientist.
The scholar Fritjof Capper classifies Da Vinci as the father of modern science. Beyond just observational drawing, he understood and applied the scientific method.
He ran experiments.
He set up controlled experiments in water flow, aerodynamics, and structural mechanics. He used systematic dissection and comparative analysis. He devised research principles that demanded reproducibility and empirical evidence, separating him from mere inventors and placing him squarely in the realm of systematic inquiry.
And what specific conceptual shifts started challenging the ancient authorities during this time?
We saw massive moves in both cosmology and anatomy. Nicholas Copernicus, positing in De Revolutionibus that the Earth moved around the sun, shattered the geocentric Ptolemaic consensus that had reigned for over a millennium.
A huge shift.
And simultaneously, in anatomy, you have Andreas Vesalius publishing De Humani Corporis Fabrica on the fabric of the human body.
And Vesalius is important not just for what he observed, but for his methodology, right?
Crucially, Vesalius directly challenged the 1500-year authority of Galen by insisting on hands-on dissection and direct observation of human bodies, not just summarizing classical texts.
And what did he find?
He found that many of Galen's anatomical assumptions were based on dissections of apes, not humans. His work, which was beautifully illustrated, gave immense confidence to the mechanistic, observation-based view of anatomy.
Even in finance, applied innovation was everywhere.
Absolutely. Luca Pacioli published a book in 1494 which contained the first comprehensive description of double-entry bookkeeping, the foundation of modern accounting, which was essential for managing the complex international trade of the merchant republics.
And finally, the Renaissance was the age that fundamentally defined the true scale of the planet through exploration.
The Age of Discovery profoundly impacted the European psyche. Between 1450 and 1650, Europeans had charted and visited every continent except Antarctica. Columbus's accidental voyage to the Americas profoundly reshaped geography and the economy.
But the ultimate feat was circumnavigation.
The circumnavigation of the globe, first completed by the Magellan-Elcano expedition between 1519 and 1522. It proved the vastness of the Pacific and provided the first concrete measurements of the planet's scale. Sir Francis Drake followed suit later in the century.
And they kept finding new land masses.
They did. Even the Australian continent, which was named New Holland at the time, was landed upon and charted by the Dutch captain Willem Jan Zoon in 1606, expanding the world map far beyond anything the classical world could have imagined.
So the intellectual fire began in Florence, but thanks to the printing press, it became a pan-European movement. Each region adapted humanism and these classical ideals to its own local culture and existing political structures.
Yes, it wasn't a monolith. It mutated as it spread.
So let's look at how the Renaissance manifested regionally, starting with England.
The English Renaissance arrived late compared to Italy. By the time Henry VII consolidated power and ended the Wars of the Roses, Italy was already deep into what we call mannerism.
So the peak was much later.
Much later. It's generally regarded as peaking in the second half of the 16th century, during the Elizabethan era.
And since England lacked the political structure of the Italian city-states and the history of classical ruins, what were the dominant art forms there? It wasn't massive sculpture and architecture.
No, the focus was overwhelmingly literary and musical, rather than visual arts on the scale of Rome. We saw the flourishing of Elizabethan literature, the great theatrical works of William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe,
Of course.
alongside the philosophical and political writings of Sir Thomas More, with Utopia, and Sir Philip Sidney's poetry. In music, composers like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd pushed the boundaries of polyphony. The cultural output was enormous, but deeply rooted in vernacular expression.
And intellectually.
Intellectually, the English context was very forward-looking. Sir Francis Bacon was a massive pioneer, moving the focus away from classical rhetoric and toward a systematic empirical method. He helped found the scientific revolution by championing inductive reasoning and observation, arguing that knowledge must be built from the ground up, not deducted from ancient premises.
Okay, next let's look at France, which ironically gave us the word Renaissance, but only received the movement by accident.
That's a good way to put it. The Italian Renaissance arrived in France abruptly in 1495, imported by King Charles VIII after his invasion and brief occupation of Italy.
So he saw it and wanted it.
He and his nobles were just stunned by the sophistication and beauty of Italian court culture and brought Italian artists and craftsmen back with them.
And King Francis I became the definitive patron of the French version.
He was instrumental. Francis I actively imported major Italian artists. Leonardo da Vinci actually spent his last years working for him.
I didn't know that.
Yes, along with Benvenuto Cellini and others. This patronage led to the construction of these vast, elaborate palaces like the Château de Chambord and the Palace of Fontainebleau, which blended Italian classical elements with traditional French design.
And there was another key Italian influence in the French court.
A pivotal one. The cultural catalyst was Catherine de' Medici, born in Florence, who married Henry II in 1533. She brought Florentine refinement directly into the French court, contributing significantly to music, arts, and even the origins of modern ballet.
Okay, moving toward Germany and the Northern Shift, what defined the Renaissance in areas closer to the Holy Roman Empire?
Well, the German Renaissance had an earlier technical start with the printing press around 1450, and artists like Albrecht Dürer were already active. Dürer was known for introducing classical proportionality to the German style, and for his incredible detail, which reflects that northern naturalism.
But the old ways held on longer.
The Gothic style and scholastic philosophy held sway longer here than in Italy, yes.
And the Reformation must have had a huge impact.
Crucially, Northern humanism became tightly interwoven with the turmoil of the Reformation. Figures like Dürer often used their art to reflect the deep theological and political disputes of the time, and the intellectual shift here was distinct.
How so?
While Italian humanists focused on rhetoric and moral philosophy, the Humanitas, the German and Dutch focus, saw a decisive shift from Aristotelian natural philosophy toward the empirical study of chemistry, botany, and the biological sciences. It was a focus on the body and the physical world that eventually led to figures like Paracelsus.
Let's talk about Hungary, which is often overlooked but was a major early Renaissance center north of the Alps.
Hungary is fascinating because the style arrived directly from Italy during the Quattrocento, sometimes skipping intermediate steps. It was, arguably, the first European country after Italy where the Renaissance appeared.
Why was that?
There were strong commercial and cultural ties dating back to the 14th century, but the key figure was the patron king Matthias Corvinus.
Right, reigning from 1458 to 1490.
And he established a court that rivaled any in Italy. He rebuilt the Palace of Buda in early Renaissance style, transforming his capital into a major artistic center. Following his marriage to Beatrice of Naples, his court attracted a massive influx of Italian scholars and artists.
And his library was famous.
His single greatest contribution might have been the Bibliotheca Corviniana. This library was Europe's greatest collection of secular books, holding texts on science, history, and classics. It was second in size only to the Vatican Library itself. It was a beacon of non-religious learning.
Incredible.
And the astronomer Johannes Regiomontanus dedicated a crucial navigation book, later used by Columbus, to Matthias, showing the profound intellectual connections between Hungarian patronage and global exploration.
Finally, let's turn to Portugal, whose contributions to the broader age and discovery are just undeniable.
Portugal was instrumental in physically broadening the European worldview. Lisbon became the pioneer headquarters of global exploration.
A hub for talent.
A hub for talent. This necessitated attracting leading experts in mathematics, astronomy, and naval technology people like Pedro Nunes, who formalized much of modern navigation, and the astronomer Abraham Zacuto.
And their maps were cutting edge.
Portuguese cartographers like Diogo Ribeiro made crucial advances in world mapping. Their trade profits, particularly from the immensely valuable spice trade, financed a unique architectural style known as manueline, a rich, ornate style blending Gothic and Renaissance motifs with nautical elements, reflecting their global reach.
And they had their own literary epic.
Luis de Camões' epic poem Os Lusíadas, which captured the grandeur of these overseas feats. And of course, it was Amerigo Vespucci sailing with the Portuguese who coined the term New World, recognizing the implications of what had been found.
So we have spent a long time discussing all these magnificent artistic and intellectual achievements, but the sources reveal a deep, necessary historiographical debate that questions the entire Golden Age narrative.
Yes.
And the idealized positive view was largely cemented by one man, Jacob Burckhardt.
Yes. Burckhardt's book, The Civilization of the Renaissance in Italy from 1860, essentially codified the modern idea of the Renaissance. He's the one who defined it as the moment the modern spirit of individuality and self-awareness was born, breaking free from the collectivist, stifling culture of the Middle Ages.
And he had that famous analogy.
The famous analogy, yes, that the change was like a veil being removed from man's eyes, allowing him to see clearly. It was incredibly powerful and shaped popular opinion for a century.
But the revisionist view argues that while the art and philosophy flourished for an elite few, life for the average person didn't necessarily improve, and in some cases, social conditions actually worsened.
That's the necessary counter-context. Revisionists point out that many negative social factors commonly associated with the medieval period, constant localized warfare, brutal political persecution, widespread poverty, seem to have worsened during the supposedly enlightened era.
For example,
we see the rise of Machiavellian political ruthlessness, the catastrophic wars of religion, the appalling corruption of figures like the Borgia popes, and, disturbingly, a significant intensification of witch hunts across Europe in the 16th century. Not exactly a golden age for everyone.
Some historians even argue it was a period of cultural decline from the High Middle Ages. Now that sounds completely counterintuitive.
This is the contention of the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga, primarily in his book The Autumn of the Middle Ages. Huizinga focused on the Low Countries and argued that the period was characterized by cultural overripeness and decline, not renewal.
And he had a very specific critique.
A very specific one. The Renaissance obsession with forcing a return to classical purity actually halted the organic evolution of medieval Latin, which was a living, flexible language of scholarship. By forcing scholars to write rigid, perfect Ciceronian Latin, they choked the life out of the common scholarly tongue.
And there were economic arguments against it being a golden age, too.
Yes, the economic historian Robert S. Lopez argued it was a period of deep economic recession. While wealth was concentrated in the hands of merchant families like the Medici, the global trade environment was increasingly fragile, leading to repeated localized banking crises, particularly in Florence, which struggled to maintain solvency despite its artistic output.
And we can't ignore the social impact, specifically regarding gender.
The critique by Joan Kelly in her essay, Did Women Have a Renaissance?, is pivotal. She argued that the Renaissance led to a greater gender dichotomy and actually lessened the agency and influence women had enjoyed during the Middle Ages.
How so?
The humanist focus on the uomo universal and this active, often militaristic civic life created an environment where female participation in public life was severely constrained. It often reduced women to decorative objects of patronage rather than active partners.
So if the historiography is split art, historians see an undeniable rebirth, but economic and social historians see a transitional period of potential decline. What's the modern consensus term?
The prevailing term among many political and economic historians is the early modern period. It's a deliberately neutral term. It highlights the era as a necessary phase between the medieval and industrial worlds, and it avoids the overly positive implication of rebirth. It acknowledges the transitional, messy nature of the shift.
But the art historian's defense still holds firm. They look at the output and say, regardless of the political upheaval, the cultural change was real and profound.
That distinction, as articulated by Panofsky, still stands. Historians focused on social, economic, or natural science are the most likely to question the term Renaissance. Conversely, students of literature and art hardly ever do. Because the radical changes in aesthetic philosophy, technique-like perspective, and oil paint and subject matter constitute an undeniable factual rebirth of classical ideals in culture. For them, it's not a metaphor, it's a reality.
This also leads us to the final nuance. This wasn't the only rebirth. We've seen that cultural revitalization is cyclical throughout history.
That's correct. Historians identify several earlier intellectual flowerings, notably the Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th and 9th centuries, and the incredibly important Renaissance of the 12th century.
And it's vital to distinguish the 12th century event from the later one.
It is. The 12th century revival focused primarily on natural sciences, logic, and mathematics, often gained through the extensive Arabic translations we discussed earlier. The famous 15th century Renaissance, however, focused on the cultural, literary, and rhetorical achievements of antiquity, gained primarily via the Byzantine transmission of Greek texts. They were two distinct waves of recovery.
So what makes our Renaissance, the one we've been talking about, unique then, is that it perfectly fused that cultural recovery with the economic power and political freedom of the Italian city-states, creating a movement that changed the modern mind forever.
That's the perfect summary.
So let's bring this deep dive back to the present. We've seen that the Renaissance was driven by two key engines working in conjunction. First, you have the intellectual engine, the systematic critical recovery and interpretation of classical humanities.
Right, the lost Latin and Greek literary and philosophical texts.
And second, the environmental engine, the profound social and economic turbulence centered in the uniquely urbanized, independent Italian city-states.
And it required immense, often brutally acquired, wealth and the political freedom afforded by these anti-monarchical republics to fuel that artistic and philosophical output. The patronage of the Medici and the economic shock of the Black Death were as important as any newly discovered Cicero manuscript.
So what does this all mean? The Renaissance was a chaotic, transitional period. It witnessed both the creation of magnificent art and architecture and the intensification of religious persecution and political corruption.
No paradox.
Absolutely. But it was revolutionary because it forced the integration of observation-based science, it legitimized vernacular literature, and it created a new, realistic art that fundamentally shifted the way Europeans perceived themselves and the world, setting the course for the modern era.
It was Niccolo Machiavelli who perfectly captured the spirit required to navigate such a tumultuous age. He wrote that one needed una lunga esperienza delle cose moderne ed una continua lezione delle antiche,
Which translates to,
a long experience with modern life and a continuous learning from antiquity. It wasn't enough just to passively recover old books. They had to be actively applied to the chaotic, messy, ambitious realities of 15th century life.
and that fusion, the old wisdom meeting the new technology, that leads us to our final thought for you to chew on. The Renaissance was amplified exponentially because the printing press was a revolutionary technology that democratized and disseminated those classical texts, creating a new integrated scholarly community across Europe. So think about today. What single powerful technology is similarly amplifying, connecting, and democratizing knowledge across the globe right now? And how might the rapid, unfiltered dissemination of information shape our own current cultural renaissance or intellectual upheaval?
A provocative question, considering we're living through a similar period of rapid change and information abundance. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
We'll see you next time.